Hey guys, so today we're going to be talking about the 1980s, and the 1980s is just a decade of Ronald Reagan. He was elected in 1980. He will be elected to a first term and a second term, and then in 1988, his vice president, George H.W. Bush, will be elected, and some people like to call that Reagan's third term. Even though he was only president in the 1980s for 1 year, we're going to pause on that one and put him with the 1990s. So we're just talking about Ronald Reagan today. Oh, in the election of 1980, this is the start of period 9 in the APUS key concept map. So period 9 goes from 1980 to present. We will be covering 1980s, a little bit in the 90s, a little bit of the stuff from the 2000s and today. But Reagan is very, very important, and his election begins the time period because of the rise of conservatism during this time period. So Ronald Reagan, he's kind of like a B-list movie star. You can kind of see if you look on YouTube and look up Ronald Reagan movies, it's kind of like cheaply made movies, but he's a pretty good actor. His whole ordeal is called the New Right, and the New Right is the rise of conservatism, including evangelical Christians, and so that will be the basis of his voters in the election of 1980. His whole value system is based on traditional American values. Think like family, hard work, religion, faith, patriotism, pride in America, things like that. And his vice president will be that's supposed to say George H.W. Bush as vice president. Let me change that really quick. There, I fixed it. So it's George Herbert Walker Bush is his vice president for both terms, and then will become president in 1988. So for the Democrats, we have Jimmy Carter, peanut farmer. He's running again. But remember that during this time period, the Iran hostage crisis is going on, where students took 52 hostages in the U.S. Embassy in Iran, and Carter is unable to successfully negotiate for them to come home, and so that leads to part of his demise in this election. So Ronald Reagan will win about exactly 50% of the popular vote, and Carter will win about 41%. But as far as electoral vote, Reagan will do a lot better. Again, the Iran hostage crisis had a lot to do with that fact. Some people like to point to this as the Reagan Revolution, and when I mean revolution, I mean it's just a change, a huge change in the ideals of America because of who is in power. So Reagan was a pretty honest, upfront guy. He said, "I'll never lie to you," just like Jimmy Carter. Again, he pushes those values: family, religion, hard work, patriotism. And he's very against things that he deemed immoral. Pornography, abortion is a hot issue during this time period because of Roe versus Wade about a decade earlier. He is against the Equal Rights Amendment, claiming that that would discriminate against those who don't fall under the category of women or minorities. And he's definitely against affirmative action for the same reason he's against the Equal Rights Amendment. He calls for faith in schools, prayer in schools, and also tougher punishment on criminals and crime, including the death penalty, and harsher punishment types in prison, less reformatory stuff, more punishment stuff. And Ronald Reagan is probably one of our most conservative presidents. So it's interesting to see how the pendulum swings. After Reagan, we'll get quite a few Democratic presidents. Well, after George H.W. Bush, we'll have Clinton and Obama kind of swing the other way. So it's just interesting now that we're in modern times to see stuff that affects us today, the pendulum swinging back and forth between Republicans and Democrats, conservative and liberal, taking power in the White House. Ronald Reagan will be president. Him and George H.W. Bush will be president at the very end of the Cold War. The Cold War technically ends in 1989, so when Ronald Reagan is leaving office and George H.W. Bush is being inaugurated, that's when the Cold War will end. So let's see what he does about the Cold War. One of the most interesting and laughable things that Ronald Reagan put forth during the Cold War was the Strategic Defense Initiative, or SDI, and some people like to call it the Star Wars Initiative. Of course, Star Wars is a popular movie in the 80s. The idea behind this is in March 1983, Reagan wants to fund a huge technological innovation to pursue missile defense systems, meaning a way to shoot down missiles if they are shot at us. And his idea is these space station satellites that are like battle stations, and they orbit Earth, and they have like these fancy laser beams essentially that can like concentrate energy enough to attack a missile had it been shot at the United States and vaporize the missiles before they're even able to reach their target. So at the time, it's like, yeah, a cool nuclear umbrella, like we are protected over American cities. But most scientists, and later on, because of the Challenger incident that we'll learn about, people will realize that this is actually impossible in the 1980s. And I'm not even sure it's possible in 2018 when we're recording this. Diplomatically, the idea behind the Strategic Defense Initiative is to scare the Soviet Union into thinking that we have those capabilities while we are developing them. And diplomatically, I guess it works because of the idea of mutually assured destruction, but in theory, it works. In practice, it would be impossible in the 1980s. So here's a picture of the idea. You have these space stations up here and ways to essentially direct the laser beam in order to attack the missiles that are coming towards us. And I love this little cartoon in the corner. It's Reagan, obviously characterized right here. And we've assembled a crack team of experts to advise us on the project. And his crack team of experts is R2-D2, C-3PO, and E.T. from popular 80s movies about space. So during this time period, there are two terms that you need to know that people start using: nuts versus mad. And nuts would be the nuclear utilization theory. And this is the idea of advocating winning a nuclear war. So what does it take to win a nuclear war? What sort of nuclear capabilities do we have to have? And what constitutes winning? And Reagan's staff will draw up these estimates of what constitutes winning, what is okay to lose and still be considered winning this war and still be considered a United States of America. And some of those losses are up to 40% of our major cities, and we would still be considered winning. So that's the idea of nuts. Let's look at the idea of mutually assured destruction, which we've talked about before. Mutually assured destruction is kind of what had been the premier thought within the decades leading up to Reagan's administration. And it literally means what it sounds like: mutually assured. Both of us are sure we're going to kill each other if we start this nuclear war. So we don't. It's like a balance of fear. I'm afraid of you, you're afraid of me. We both have the same sort of technological implications. And so if one of us shoots, the other one is going to shoot, and everyone's going to die. So we just don't do it. But that essentially Reagan's Cold War strategy is come up with new nuclear tactics, as well as tons and tons of defense spending, so much defense spending. And that kind of starts the whole conservative idea of spending a lot on the military in the modern times, okay? So moving on to what's going on directly with the USSR, not just behind the scenes when we are developing nuclear capabilities, let's zero in on Poland. So we're in 1982 here, and there's a solidarity movement in Poland, and it's essentially a revolution to overthrow the communist sphere of the USSR communist sphere of influence in Poland. They want to loosen the USSR's control, but essentially the Polish military, egged on by the USSR, stopped them and intimidated the Polish revolutionaries so much that order was restored. Reagan wants no part of this. He embargoes a bunch of important things that the USSR needs from us, such as grain sales and certain metals and oil. And so by embargoing both of them, he's sending a message that he doesn't want to deal with it at that time period. We also have the CAL or CAL incident. That's Korean Airlines 007 incident. No, not like James Bond. But this is 1983, and it's not talked about very often. And I don't even think it's in either of your textbooks, the ones I've been printing out, or the or Henrietta. But it's essentially a Korean airline left from JFK in airport in New York City and landed in Anchorage, Alaska for a layover. And then they left from Anchorage, Alaska, and they were headed to Seoul in Korea. And just let me show you the picture here. So the airline intended to go in United States airspace all the way over, but essentially this is what happened. They accidentally went through the airspace called a no-fly zone of the USSR, and they were shot down. Now the USSR supported its own decision to do so because it wasn't a no-fly zone and they were afraid that it was a U-2 spy plane. But the plane will crash land and all 296, I believe, passengers and crew will die. And some of those were Americans, including a House of Representatives congressman from Georgia died on this flight on his way to Korea. And so after this, the all arms control negotiations that we were having with the USSR were ceased by Reagan as a point to say you shouldn't have shot down an innocent passenger liner. It was a Boeing 747 with about 300 people on it. We have continued issues with communism in the Middle East. Starting in Lebanon, there's a communist uprising fueled by the issues going on between the Palestinians and the Israelis in this time period. So Reagan had sent Marines to Lebanon in 1983 as part of like a peacekeeping. Let's keep them away from each other. Let's not let them cause issues in Lebanon, a nearby country. And in 1983, a suicide bomber, I already said it was 1983, right? Yeah. Has a truck of explosives and drives his truck into Marine barracks, and 241 Marines are killed in Lebanon. So that's a foreign policy issue that Reagan has to deal with at the time. Also in Lebanon during this time period that I didn't write down, but we'll get to it later, a bunch of hostages are taken by the Iranian government. So next door is Iran, and they will take hostages, again, 7 American hostages, in the hopes of getting something from the United States that we're going to talk about later. In Libya, Reagan will order a series of bombings in 1986 in retaliation for their bombing of a place in West Berlin that allegedly had killed a U.S. serviceman, and so just issues stemming further from Cold War into the Middle East. And finally, Iran and Iraq are involved in their own war. Iran, if you remember, was taken over by an Islamic government under Ayatollah Khomeini that we talked about during the Iran hostage crisis. And so the U.S. at this point will help Iraq fight against Iran and the Islamic State for quite some time. And so we are actually backing Iraq and the leader Saddam Hussein for quite some time in the 1980s before we ourselves start to not get along with them. So here's the picture of the bombing in Lebanon of the Marine barracks where 241 Marines were killed. We also have communist issues stemming in Latin America, one of which is in Nicaragua. So we have the I spelled that wrong. One second, guys. Sorry about that. So we have the Sandinistas. They are a communist group in Nicaragua attempting to overthrow the government. They condemn everything U.S. They're socialist revolutionaries. They don't like capitalism. They don't like democracy. Well, Reagan essentially is going to send covert operations via the CIA to help the Contra, which is the name for the rebels there. And the Contra he likens to our founding fathers, saying that they are so moral and so good, when in actuality their funding for their weapons before the U.S. helps them was straight from a cocaine drug cartel. So are they like the founding fathers? Probably not, but they aren't communist, and so that's why the U.S. decides to back them. In El Salvador, we will send military advisors to help prop up a non-communist government. Notice my wording there. I did not say democratic capitalist government. I said non-communist. So it's a situation where the United States is so against the idea of communism that they're willing to back a not so great regime in other countries. And actually, news of the government, the regime that the United States is backing up, having roaming. All right, so in El Salvador, we are backing a non-communist regime that isn't great. And this regime literally has like roaming gangs of government-paid death squads, eliminating hundreds, if not thousands, of people and groups that oppose their regime. And so it's not great that we're backing them, but they're not communist. So that is still the prevailing idea, even towards the end of the Cold War. And finally, in Grenada in 1983, Reagan will send 6,000 troops to this tiny little island in the Caribbean. And this island had recently had a revolution, a Marxist revolution, where a communist regime had come to power. And the U.S. forces, 6,000 troops, easily overran the island and restored the previous regime back to power. So during Reagan and George H.W. Bush's administrations, we're going to see the Cold War end. So let's talk about it. We can't really point to Reagan and say he ended the Cold War. Essentially, it was the USSR leader Mikhail Gorbachev, and there he is on the right next to Reagan on the left. And so Gorbachev's ideas are very reform-minded. He is not like his predecessors, especially not like the beginning of the Soviet Union with Stalin. He advocates more free speech. I'm not saying 100% free speech, but more free speech, more economic reforms that involve capitalism business structures, and some local democratic elections. And the two Russian words that we learn for this in world history is glasnost and perestroika. Glasnost means openness, so that means less censorship and more freedom of speech. And perestroika means restructuring, and that means restructuring their economic system into more of a capitalist system, but not quite capitalist. During Gorbachev's time with Reagan, they will negotiate real nuclear arms reduction. So it's actually going to happen instead of just talking about it with the SALT treaties. We will also get INF reductions, and INF is intermediate range nuclear forces. I know the R is not in there. It should be IRNF, but it's INF treaty. And this is signed in Washington, D.C. right before Reagan leaves the presidency. And it says no intermediate range nuclear missiles. None. Absolutely eliminates them, which is a breakthrough in the Cold War. Previously, with our SALT and SALT II treaties and other arms reductions negotiations, it was a reduction, not an elimination. So this is a big deal. It's significant, and Gorbachev and Reagan agree that nuclear war can't be won and should never be fought. It's kind of the idea of mutually assured destruction. So in 1989 is when we actually see the Iron Curtain fall. And the Iron Curtain, again, was the sharp division between communism and the Western states in Europe. And here's some of the reasons why. It's expensive for the Soviet Union. Having those satellites, that Soviet sphere of influence that reaches all over Eastern Europe and even into Asian countries, it's a lot of money. Politically, it's a lot of stress. And it's just a lot of burden for the Soviet Union to handle. And so when Gorbachev started his glasnost and perestroika reforms, as well as free speech, essentially he opens up the door for opposition. And when you open up the door for opposition, you open up the door for revolution. And the first one to go is Poland. Poland, the Solidarity Revolution that had been kind of shot down by the USSR before, will open up again, and Poland will win its independence. Next goes Hungary. Not Hungary, Hungary. One second. Sorry, typo. I fixed it. Next goes Hungary, and then within the year, Bulgaria, Czechoslovakia, and Romania, all of those will leave the USSR and become their own independent nations with their own, some of them elections, some of them not. Of course, the U.S. is hoping and supporting those nations that decide to have democratic elections in a capitalist economic system. In 1990, the Berlin Wall will fall in November, and 1989, and then in 1990, Germany will be completely reunified. So we will no longer have an East Germany and a West Germany. We will no longer have an East Berlin and a West Berlin. And I've showed you the pictures of the Berlin Wall falling before. So families are reunited. People have more economic opportunity with both sides open. And Germany will become its own country without the influence of the Western European states that we supported, or the Soviet Union influence in the East. We'll also see further nuclear arms reduction with the perpetuation of the START Treaty, and that strategic arms reduction. And it cut about 10% of all nuclear weapons in the United States and about 25% of all nuclear weapons in the USSR. So it actually is a good step forward to reducing nuclear weapons. And in 1991, with all of those states backing out of the USSR and Gorbachev letting them go, the Soviet Union officially dissolves, and we have Russia and a bunch of independent states around it. So let's talk about what Reagan does at home during this time period. First and foremost, the most important thing you need to know about Reagan is Reaganomics. And Reaganomics is his plan to fix the stagflation. Remember, stagflation was low productivity, high unemployment, and rising inflation. Inflation had creeped to about 13% in this time period, and this is his plan to fix it. It is supply-side economics, which you will learn more about next year in Mr. Sayers' economics class. But essentially, this is the hope and the plan behind it. Cut taxes, and if you cut taxes, hopefully people will invest that money. If people invest that money, businesses grow, production grows, and if production grows, businesses grow, then there's more job opportunities. And if there's more job opportunities, there's more money in people's pockets, which means further prosperity. It's trickle-down economics. And we know that trickle-down economics doesn't work, but it is so ingrained in the conservative psyche that cutting taxes, especially the top tier of taxes for the rich, will essentially trickle down or cause prosperity in the lower classes of who truly needs it. So the idea, again, behind it is that even though there's less taxes, the government's bringing in less revenue through taxes, with more production means the government will bring in revenue on things like sales taxes or business taxes. So it does cut income tax quite a bit. Here are the 4 pillars of Reaganomics. So 4 things that we're going to talk about when it comes to Reagan's plan for the stagflation plaguing the U.S. economy. Reduce federal income and capital gains taxes. We've talked about that, the trickle-down theory. Reduce federal spending. Reagan doesn't do that much. He likes to spend money on the army. Reducing government regulation, which he does too, and tightening the money supply to reduce inflation. So attempting to fix the deeper issue of inflation and not just slapping a Band-Aid on it, kind of like our past presidents at this time period. So here's his plan for the budget. He calls it the Economic Recovery Act or Tax Act. His budget is to cut 25%, that is 1/4 of government spending over 3 years. If you cut taxes, you have to cut government spending, right? But here is where he's enacting those large budget cuts. Domestic programs, food stamps, education, public housing, National Endowment for the Arts and Humanities, school funding, PBS, all of those programs that LBJ had fought for in the Great Society and that Nixon had kind of put forward as well, and Jimmy Carter. He's going to cut those programs. However, he is criticized for this, so he claims he's going to keep a safety net for those that truly can't care for themselves and their families, like the disabled, or for those who have a one-income household, or truly unemployed, unable to work, those that need child care. Here's the issue with the whole Reaganomics thing. He will cut government spending, but the defense budget, his military spending, will increase by $12 billion during his presidency. He is super into building up the military and building up nuclear arms before those nuclear arms reduction treaties happen. So during his time as president, we are going to see huge budget deficits that result in the rise of national debt. And it will triple. I want to say triple. Yep, because it's $1 trillion in 1980, and by the end of his presidency in 1988, our national debt is $3 trillion. So he promised to cut taxes. He did cut taxes, but then halfway through his presidency, when he runs again in 1984, he no longer promises to cut taxes. In fact, taxes had to be implemented to make up for the growing deficit that was happening, where he had cut taxes before, but is still increasing defense spending. So in this time period, in the mid-1980s, the U.S. becomes a debtor nation for the first time since World War I. We had a huge post-World War I boom, huge post-World War II boom. Here it ends. Our national debt is rising so much that we owe more people anything more than what we're taking out, and the U.S. is still in debt to this day. It starts in the mid-1980s. One pillar of Reaganomics is deregulation, and deregulation is the taking off of strict rules for businesses in the hopes that they'll grow more. And he will deregulate long-distance phone calling through AT&T and airlines, trucking industry, real quick, let me make sure I got all of that, as well as lots of banks and loaning mortgage companies. And because he's deregulating and putting less measures, like you can't do this, you have to have price controls, kind of like during Nixon's era, he put on price controls to stop inflation from growing. When those price controls stop, then big companies kind of eat up the smaller companies, and the smaller companies die out. One issue during this time period is savings and loans institutions, so not just banks, but also places that hold money. I'm trying to think of a good example that you guys would know. Investors, mortgage companies, stuff like that. With those deregulations, many of those go under and then ask for a government bailout. Well, when banks fail and the government bails them out because your money's insured that's in a bank, who's footing the bill of that? In actuality, you are. The taxpayer is footing the bill of government bailouts. One result of the deregulation of private industries during Reagan's administration is that when we deregulate, companies have the ability to create larger companies and consolidate, not like quite to the extent of trusts, but this will lead to multinational corporations. Think like Hilton. There's a Hilton hotel in every single country in the world, I bet. If not every single country, then very, very close to it. So these multinational corporations, they're pushing towards a global economy that we have today. At home, he continues to cut taxes until that deficit kind of hits in the mid-1980s, and he will also reform immigration. And the deal with immigration in 1986 is, if you remember, in 1965, it was just open immigration with preference given to those with family members, spouses, or skills vital to the United States. Well, even with that open immigration, there was a large influx of undocumented or illegal immigration. And so the immigration reform in 1986, one second. Sorry about that. The immigration reform in 1986 tries to make it a little bit harder for undocumented immigrants to come to America and to get jobs. And it does so by placing fines and penalties on businesses who hire those undocumented workers. It also offered resident alien status to anyone who proved they'd been living here since 1982, as well as increase the resources of the Immigration and Naturalization Services, so just attempting to fund them a little bit more in order to promote legal immigration. Last thing, or second soon to be last thing, of Reagan's domestic policy, and not really domestic, this is more foreign, is the Iran-Contra scandal or Iran-Contra affair during this time period. So essentially, remember in Nicaragua, there was the Contra fighting against the Sandistas, who were a communist regime rising in Nicaragua, and we were funding them. We were also had an embargo on Iran because of the whole hostage crisis, Khomeini, the Islamic State, coming to power and overthrowing the regime that was there. One second. You're about to switch over to the third video. So, Reagan will agree to a backdoor deal to sell weapons to Iran, which we had embargoed because we didn't like their government. We didn't like the Islamic State under Khomeini. So he agrees to sell weapons in exchange for our hostages, a different set of hostages than the one that we talked about last lecture. These hostages that were taken by some Iranians in Lebanon. So we agree to that. We sell them weapons. The hostages are taken. That's not where are let go. And that's not where the scandal ends. That money, which is like $23 billion that we get from Iran, will then be used to fund the Contra rebels in Latin America and Nicaragua that are fighting against the Sandinistas in Nicaragua. So we're taking illegal money that we're not supposed to get because we're not supposed to sell Iran weapons, and then using it to fund a terrible, terrible rebel scheme in Nicaragua just because it's not communist. On the left, we see the Time magazine cover of Oliver North, who was the appropriator of the funds, saying, "I was authorized to do everything that I did. So don't point fingers at me. It was Reagan and the defense analysts of the time that told me to do this." Also at home, and this is actually really, really sad, during towards the end of a lot of space spending, we'll have the Challenger explosion. So this is in 1986. Let me find in my notes. Yeah, here it is, February 1986. And there's an issue with their spacecraft where some of the seals, the rubber seals that kept things together, weren't properly sealed. And so wet and cold moisture got into an area of the spacecraft that wasn't supposed to, and it exploded right after taking off over America and landed in the ocean, the parts of it. And actually some of the body parts of the 7 astronauts, including the first teacher to ever go to space, were found among the wreckage. And if you look it up, you can actually Google the live TV broadcast of the Challenger explosion, because it was on TV and people were watching it not knowing it was going to explode, but just hoping to see them off into space. And so this hurts NASA's reputation and credibility. It reinforces doubts about the strategic defense, the SDI, the Star Wars idea that we can shoot down missiles, because if we can't even properly get a space shuttle to the moon and back, then can we truly create this umbrella of anti-missile weapons defense above the United States? So looking at Reagan as a whole, he cut taxes quite a few times, even though he had to end up raising them a little bit later. And defense spending was massive during his time period. Massive, massive defense spending. He is one of our most conservative presidents. And as such, going along with that trickle-down economics conservative theme, the U.S. will end up in a major debt during his presidency, a huge deficit, and the U.S. will become a debtor to a lot of countries in the world, just like we are today. One thing that he did do was, in his budget cuts, he did reduce the size of the government, which is another conservative ideal. But in doing so, in cutting taxes, bringing in less revenue, reducing the size of the government, he is also cutting social welfare spending that many presidents before him had fought for, because less money was available to the government. So in 1988, George H.W. Bush, his vice president for 2 terms, will be elected to the presidency. And some people will jokingly call it Reagan's 3rd term, because George H.W. Bush will be very conservative as well. We will cover the highlights of his presidency in our next lecture that covers 1990s, 2000s, all the way up until like yesterday. So I'll see you then. Thank you.